Under 1811?
Yes, I'd like to report a body.
What do you mean a body?
A dead person.
Okay, where at?
Okay, Grand Haven Township.
Uh-huh.
Let's see, 152nd and Winnan.
Okay.
About 100 yards to the east of 152nd on Winnan.
East of 152nd on Winnan?
Yep, and I'll be there with a pickup, sitting, waiting for someone to...
Was it in the woods, or?
It's in my field, and it's burned. And it wasn't there yesterday.
Can you tell if it's a male or female, or?
It's pretty badly burned.
On the morning of May 8, 2002, a farmer in Ottawa County, Michigan, made a gruesome discovery. In the center of a cluster of trees was a metal footlocker, and in it, the charred remains of a human body. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the farm and began processing the scene, but despite the large amount of physical evidence, the victim couldn't be identified. The John Doe was given the moniker Jack in the Box as investigators worked to solve the mystery. However, an anonymous tip 13 years later would help investigators identify the man. But how had he come to be in the field? And who had lit the match to his fiery end? May 8, 2002 was a crisp spring morning in Ottawa County, Michigan. Farmer Gordon DeVries was up early that morning doing his routine farm inspections. After spending the morning confirming orders, he decided to stop by the farmhouse around 2 p.m. that same afternoon. While driving toward his blueberry fields, he noticed something unusual in the undergrowth near a cluster of trees. At first, Gordon didn't believe what he'd seen was real. However, on a second drive past the tree line, he stopped, got out of his truck, and walked toward the object. What he saw left him in disbelief. Inside a metal footlocker was a badly burned human body. The area around the body had also been scorched. The smell of gasoline and burnt flesh hung heavy in the air. Gordon didn't have his phone, but remembered seeing a neighboring farmer earlier. He drove to the neighboring field and asked the second farmer to come back with him to where he'd seen the body. Using the neighbor's phone, Gordon called 911 to report the discovery.
Under 1811?
Yes, I'd like to report a body.
What do you mean a body?
A dead person.
Okay, where at?
Okay, Grand Haven Township.
Uh-huh.
Let's see, 152nd and Winnan.
Deputies from the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office arrived at the farm and began cordoning off the area. Detective Robert Donker led the investigation and was joined by the medical examiner, Dr. Cole. Nature had been working against the investigation team as it had been raining and much of the trace evidence had been washed away. What they did find was a rope tied around the victim's neck, the charred remains of a broken bat, a hammer in a pile of ashes, and a yellow cushion beneath the metal trunk. It was apparent to investigators that they were dealing with a homicide. The body was taken away for an autopsy with the hope that perhaps they could find a way to identify the victim. Little would they know how big of a challenge it would prove to be. Not only was the body burnt beyond recognition, but the victim's fingers had also been severely burned and no fingerprints could be taken. In so much uncertainty, even an obvious revelation seemed to give hope. So all that the medical examiner was able to determine was that the victim was a man. The victim was then labeled a John Doe. Further examination revealed that the victim had suffered extensive blunt force trauma to the head, caused by the hammer found at the scene. But that was not the cause of his death. According to the coroner, the victim had been strangled as there was evidence of a broken neck and remnants of a plastic bag that had melted and stuck to the back of the victim's head. The coroner believed that the victim had died before being burned because there was no smoke found in his lungs. The victim had also undergone extensive dental work, which the coroner believed wasn't performed in the United States. Dental molds were made so that investigators could search records for the victim's identity. DNA and blood samples were also collected and sent for testing against criminal profiles on the National Police Database. While awaiting the results of the testing, the John Doe was returned to the county morgue, and the department started referring to him as Jack in the Box. Investigators theorized that the man may have been a migrant worker who'd met a violent end. Weeks passed, but no one came forward with information regarding a missing person, and without any formal identification, they couldn't find his dental records. The DNA samples also proved a failure, as the victim had not been listed in any police databases. Jack was eventually laid to rest at Lakeshore Cemetery in Grand Haven Township, Michigan. Engraved on his gravestone were the words, "Unidentified man, May 2002, known only to God." For the next 3 years, investigators worked hard to identify Jack in the Box, but their leads were drying up fast. At that moment, Ottawa County Sheriff Gary Rosema had an idea that he believed would reignite interest in the case. He approached David Schock, a professor of communications at Hope College in Michigan. The idea was for David and his film students to make a documentary covering the murder of the Jack in the Box victim. After agreeing to make the documentary, David and his team were given exclusive access to the crime scene and interviews with the investigation team. The nearly hour-long documentary premiered online in May 2005. It included interviews with Gordon DeVries, who discovered the body, and the entire investigation team. The documentary also covered and highlighted the area where the body was discovered, the evidence found, and autopsy reports. However, the documentary did not have the outcome investigators had wanted. Unfortunately, the case started to lose traction and grew cold. Filed away as a cold case, the Jack in the Box victim remained unknown, and the hopes of the investigation team began to dwindle. But a big twist was about to transform everything. An email sent to the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office in 2015, 10 years after the documentary initially aired, would change the course of the investigation and bring the cold case to the forefront. In 2015, the Sheriff's Office received an anonymous tip that the man known as the Jack in the Box was probably the stepfather of Deneen Ducharme, Roberto Caraballo, who also used the alias Juan Cintron. When they located Deneen Ducharme, she had an interesting story to tell investigators. According to Deneen, her stepfather had gone missing in May 2002. When she'd asked her mother, Beverly McCallum, about what happened, Beverly seemed cold, detached, and dismissive. After watching the documentary, Deneen was struck by the description of the body being small in stature and possibly belonging to a migrant worker. She was also familiar with the area, and she and her mother had lived with Roberto in Michigan around 2002. Deneen told detectives that Roberto had done some time in federal prison for fraud-related charges. There was also a metal footlocker in which the body was found. Deneen knew that her mother had kept family photos in a similar-looking trunk in their living room. This was the clue investigators had hoped for, and they located Deneen in Houston, Texas in April 2015 to ask her about Roberto. According to Deneen, Beverly was unhappy with Roberto, and soon after his disappearance, she'd moved to Jamaica to be with a longtime lover named Rinnie. According to Deneen, whenever she asked Beverly about Roberto, her mother would never give any answers. Deneen told both detectives that Beverly was a controlling and manipulative person. She described their relationship as toxic, and that Beverly always got her way by any means possible. Deneen was certain that her mother had something to do with Roberto going missing, and possibly his death. With this information, the detectives reopened the cold case. Although Deneen's story sounded vague, investigators now had gotten what they'd been wanting for years: a lead. Detective Donker mulled over this information. From what Deneen told him, Roberto had spent some time in prison, so Donker looked through prison records. He didn't find Roberto, but found the name Juan Cintron, who had lived in Charlotte, Michigan. It was the alias Roberto had used. The address of 334 Horatio Street matched with Juan Cintron and was the same home Deneen mentioned living in with her family. Donker also received the results of the dental record check. The records matched Juan, who it turned out was actually Roberto. They had finally identified their Jack in the Box. In their investigation, detectives developed a profile of Roberto. He was an immigrant from the Dominican Republic who'd come to the United States. He'd been involved in numerous fraud-related crimes that led him to be imprisoned several times. They'd also learned that Roberto had been reported as a defaulter by his parole officer after he was last heard from on May 6, 2002. After procuring a search warrant, investigators and forensic teams descended on 334 Horatio Street. The house was abandoned, but there were signs of remodeling being done. A sweep of the house revealed no evidence to suggest that any crime had taken place. There was no forensic evidence or signs of repairs done to the house to cover up a crime. Investigators were forced to go back and speak with Deneen again. The second interview with Deneen proved to be even more informative because it involved talking with both Deneen and her cousin Tanya. They now learned that Beverly had 2 more daughters. a girl named Tasha from her second husband, Lenny Byam, and the youngest named Sicily with Roberto. Now, the full story was just about to come to light. When detectives told Deneen that they hadn't found any clues indicating that a murder had taken place in the house, Deneen revealed yet another layer to the mystery. She confessed that Roberto's murder had taken place in the basement of the house. This was news to Donker and Maltby, who hadn't been told this information earlier. Deneen appeared ready to spill the beans this time around. She told the detectives that Beverly had actually owned two trunks, a green one that she used to keep photos, and a black trunk similar to the one Roberto was found in that was always kept next to the bed, but had disappeared around the same time as Roberto. Furthermore, Deneen told detectives that she had to chip away at concrete and replace a patch in their basement at her mother's request because there was blood splatter on the floor. Deneen explained that a man named Chris would be able to back up her story of Roberto's murder if they could find him. During their interview with Deneen, both Donker and Maltby felt that there was more to the story, but didn't voice their suspicions. With this new revelation, investigators returned to 334 Horatio Street. In the basement, forensic teams started to scrape away at painted surfaces and look for cement chips. What they found was two different patches of cement. After removing both patches and scraping away the paint along the basement stairs and posts, these materials were sent for testing. A few weeks later, the results were in, and human DNA was found in the paint scrapings and in the pieces of cement. This was tested against Roberto's DNA and proved to be a match. The confirmation allowed detectives now to make contact with Roberto's family. Further investigation led Donker and Maltby to discover that Roberto's family members had tried reaching out to Beverly in October 2002. However, she disappeared, and they'd been left in the dark about what had happened to Roberto. These interviews helped detectives find yet another link to Roberto. The family had been in contact with Sicily, Roberto's youngest daughter, and they provided the detectives with her address. They also told them that Sicily may be able to help fill in some of the missing pieces in the story of Roberto's disappearance. In October 2016, Detective Donker and Maltby were able to find Sicily, who was living in Houston, Texas. Their arrival was a bittersweet pill for her to swallow. The detectives explained that they'd come to inform her that Roberto had been identified as the Jack-in-the-Box victim from back in May 2002. Sitting down to interview Sicily, both men started to learn about a different side to their victim Roberto. Sicily told them that her life had been tumultuous, as life with Beverly was always unexpected. She remembered that when Roberto was finally released from prison, his presence had brought with it a sense of order. Sicily recalled how her father had introduced routine into their lives and encouraged her to take up extracurricular activities. Roberto, according to Sicily, often took her to the local recreation center and made her participate in gymnastics and softball.
He would take me to gymnastics and swimming across the street from the Horatio home at the recreational center. And he got me involved in playing softball. He was a big baseball fan. I hated it at first, but I grew to love it. It was down in the basement. That's where he would speak on the phone with his relatives and write his letters privately, read his Bible privately.
But one day, all that changed. When she returned from school, she noticed the door to the basement had been padlocked. When she questioned Beverly about Roberto, she was told that Roberto had left the family and returned to his old life in Canada. She found this odd because Roberto's car was still in the driveway and many of his personal belongings were still around the house.
A part of my regular routine was to come home after school and go to the basement to greet my father and let him know that I was home. So there was a padlock and it wasn't accessible anymore. Although she told me that he took off to Canada, I, at the time, could connect that Canada was within driving distance and his vehicle was still in the driveway. So I thought that was strange.
When Sicily was asked by the detectives if she remembered anything from the day Roberto disappeared, she recalled being woken up in the middle of the night by Beverly. Sicily, along with her mother and half-sisters Deneen and Tasha, had driven some distance away from Charlotte, Michigan. Both girls had fallen asleep again during the drive. Sicily said that she woke up again after hearing an explosion and saw her half-sister Deneen running from a fire in the woods. She told Donker that Deneen was running to catch up with the van while her mother was driving away from the woods.
Yes, I remember being startled out of my sleep and rushed into our family van. I was used to the turmoil, so somewhere along everything, I was asleep in the back of the van. I know we were driving for quite some time, just because I know Charlotte is a small town, and we were in there for a while on the road. Like I said, I remember falling asleep and being woken up by an explosion in the woods was the next I recall from that night. I sat up and looked out the back of the window where the explosion was coming from. I noticed my half-sister running from the woody area away from the fire. Our van was already pretty much moving. The door was open, and she was trying to catch up to the vehicle as if it was a getaway van.
Remembering that Roberto was found in a wooded area that appeared scorched by a massive bonfire, Donker and Maltby started to put the pieces together. Further interviews with Sicily provided a clearer picture of the life she led with Beverly. Growing up, life with Beverly was strained. She described her mother as being the person in charge of the household and controlling everything. When asked about her mother's relationship with her sisters and herself, Sicily explained that Beverly controlled their actions.
My mom was always the matriarch in charge of the household. Like I said, my dad, he hadn't been with us full time before, so it was always just her.
She described it as she and her sisters being henchmen and following the instructions of their mother. She also explained that while living at the house on Horatio Street in Charlotte, a man named Christopher McMillan regularly visited their home. He'd been friends with both Beverly and Deneen. Even after Roberto had left, Christopher maintained a close relationship with her family. She was able to provide detectives with a picture of Christopher, hoping it would help the investigation. Beverly allegedly didn't want Sicily to use her real name while on social media and even suggested aliases she could use. Sicily recalled that Beverly often tried to scare her away from asking too many questions, especially about her father. Eventually, Sicily made contact with relatives from her father's family, and when she turned 18, she decided to move out on her own. This incident infuriated Beverly to the point that she started attacking Sicily's car as she was leaving their family home once and for all. However, Sicily had not given up on getting answers from her mother about Roberto. In 2014, she visited her mother in Houston, Texas, and confronted her about what happened to Roberto. And to her surprise, Beverly confessed.
And so how my mom described it is that as she was going up the stairs, my dad began to pull her by her ankles to pull her back down, and that she grabbed the nearest thing she could with her right hand, which happened to be a crowbar, is what she said, and she swung it like that, the back of her head, to try to get away from him, and that her words, he started bleeding profusely from the head.
When Sicily asked her why she hadn't called an ambulance, Beverly told her that Deneen and her friends were already approaching the basement. Beverly explained that Deneen had come there to finish off Roberto and that they were responsible for Roberto's death. Beverly had placed all the blame on Deneen and her friends, stating that she couldn't stop them. To Sicily, this sounded odd because Beverly had always been the one in control. It was clear to detectives that Beverly McCallum had wreaked severe emotional damage on her daughters, but something had still seemed off. To an extent, Deneen and Sicily's versions of the story matched. However, what Sicily told them about Deneen's involvement troubled them. It was time for them to return to Michigan and find Christopher McMillan. After tracking down Christopher to Grand Rapids, Michigan, they set up an interview. What he told them was about to change the course of the investigation. Over a set of 3 interviews, Christopher confirmed that he was indeed friends with both Deneen and Beverly. He told officers that in his interactions with the family, Roberto and Beverly would argue frequently and that Roberto was not particularly fond of him. He went on to tell detectives of how the plan to get rid of Roberto came together. Chris was over at their home one day in May 2002 when another argument broke out between Roberto and Beverly. While relaxing with Deneen, she told him that Beverly was tired of Roberto and wanted a way out of the marriage. Deneen had also alleged that Roberto had been assaulting Beverly and the other girls. Deneen then asked Christopher if he'd help her and Beverly get rid of Roberto.
Deneen and Beverly wanted to get rid of him because he was abusing the kids and Beverly physically, mentally. Deneen told me that Beverly wanted to knock him unconscious and suffocate him.
Soon after Deneen made the request, Beverly had also spoken to Christopher. Her idea was to push Roberto down the basement stairs and suffocate him while he was still unconscious. Christopher also confessed that the three of them had planned and performed a test run the day before Roberto's murder. Christopher admitted that he went along with the plan because he didn't believe the two women would actually carry out the murder on their own. He then told both detectives exactly what happened. On the morning of May 7, 2002, Beverly called both Deneen and Christopher into the basement. She then gave Christopher a wooden baseball bat and told him to knock Roberto out after she'd pushed him down the stairs. Then Beverly left, and Christopher remained in the basement with Deneen and smoked until they heard Roberto and Beverly talking upstairs. A while later, the door opened at the top, and Christopher watched as Beverly kicked Roberto down the stairs. Roberto came to a stop at the bottom of the staircase on his knees. It was now time for Christopher's part of the plan. He took a swing at Roberto's head but missed and hit a concrete post, causing the bat to break into pieces.
Opens, down comes Robert, and Beverly was behind him. They come down a few steps. Beverly kicked Robert down the stairs. I swung the bat. I hit the post. I broke the bat. He was kind of at his knees.
He then saw Deneen swinging a hammer at Roberto's head. By that time, Beverly had also come downstairs, and she told Deneen to give her the hammer. She continued to hit Roberto on the left side of his head until the hammer lodged in his skull. Seeing this, Christopher moved towards Roberto and pulled the hammer out.
And Beverly starts to tell Deneen, "Give me the hammer, give me the hammer." Well, Deneen takes the hammer and with her right hand wants to hit him a couple times on the left side of his head. Beverly jerks the hammer away and with her left hand on the left side of the head hits him like 3 or 4 more times until the hammer was in his head. So he was on his knees with the hammer sticking out of his head. I took the hammer, I pulled the hammer out. I'm holding the hammer. There's a hole about $half size.
He dropped the hammer on the floor and turned around to see Deneen pulling a bag over Roberto's head and tightening a rope around his neck. He watched as Beverly sat on Roberto's body to keep him pinned down on the floor as Deneen suffocated Roberto.
I turned back around and there's a bag on his head. Deneen's behind him. He's laying on his back with a rope. Deneen was holding the bag. Beverly was sitting up on top of him to keep him from moving. And he laid like that until the bag quit moving in and out and he quit breathing.
After Roberto had been killed, the trio changed their clothes before going to the store to buy cleaning supplies. Upon returning to the house, Beverly and Deneen went down to the basement to start cleaning up. Christopher stayed at the house and when school was out, went to fetch Tasha and Sicily. Much later that evening, he helped Beverly and Deneen move Roberto, who had been placed in the footlocker, to the back of Roberto's van.
How do you know that Robert is in that trunk?
Because it wasn't closed all the way. And I lifted the lid up and tried to close it. I couldn't get it closed.
Now, when you go down to that basement, do you see the bat?
No.
How about the hammer that you pulled out of his head?
No.
Did you ever see that bat or hammer ever again?
No.
So you are told to help pick Robert up and take him out of the house?
Yes.
Who tells you to do that?
Beverly.
Once again, it's the defendant telling you what to do, is that right?
Yes.
Who does she tell to do that to?
Deneen and myself.
So Deneen, who is the defendant's daughter, and you then carry Robert out of the basement in that trunk?
Yes.
Where do you carry him to?
We put him in the back of a van that Robert owned.
So you're using Robert's own van to carry him away?
Yes.
Now, what else do you do once you put Robert in the van?
We put a gas can back there.
Why'd you put a gas can back there?
Because we were going to burn the body.
Who had told you you were going to do that?
Beverly.
Beverly then woke Tasha and Sicily up and took them along to dispose of Roberto's body. At Beverly's direction, Deneen drove to a gas station to buy gasoline to burn Roberto's body. They then drove to a wooded area about 45 minutes away from the family home. Christopher and Deneen then got the footlocker out of the van and dragged the trunk up to some undergrowth using a cushion from the van. Until this point of the confession, much of Christopher's story seemed to correlate with Sicily's memory.
So what happens after that ring is obtained?
We poured gas on the body,
Who poured gas on?
Beverly and I.
You both poured gas on?
She poured the gas, I lit the fire.
However, what he told them next provided more detail of Beverly's possible involvement. After some back and forth, Deneen went back to the van. Christopher was joined by Beverly, and together they set Roberto's body alight and fled the scene.
He opened the hatch of the van and pulled Robert out on a cushion or a piece of carpet. And we pulled him up under, Deneen and I pulled him underneath the gate.
Next, Christopher told the detectives of all three of them having disposed of their shoes before running to the house. The next morning, Beverly took the van and had all the tires changed. He and Deneen went down to the basement and, at the direction of Beverly, painted over the blood splatter. Blood had also soaked into parts of the cement, and he and Deneen ended up chipping away at the area to get rid of the evidence. He then helped Deneen mix a batch of cement and cover up the areas where the blood had soaked in too deeply. Christopher told detectives that soon after, Beverly and Deneen had started packing up the house as they planned to move. Beverly had started telling people that she was moving away as Roberto had abandoned their family. She took Sicily and Tasha to Jamaica, and Deneen made the move to Texas. With nowhere to stay, Christopher also moved with Beverly to Jamaica. In 2018, 16 years after Roberto's murder, warrants of arrest were issued for Deneen Ducharme, Christopher McMillan, and Beverly McCallum. Deneen and Christopher were arrested and detained at the Eaton County Jail, but finding Beverly was going to prove more difficult. Investigators learned that Beverly had remarried and moved to Pakistan with her new husband. The United States and Pakistan did have an extradition treaty in place, but the process was going to be long and arduous. While working to have Beverly brought back to face justice, investigators and prosecutors simultaneously worked on developing the cases against Deneen and Christopher. Both suspects were offered a plea deal. However, Deneen refused to take one, claiming she was entirely innocent. Christopher agreed to turn state witness. In October 2019, Christopher pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to 15 years minimum. Deneen went to trial in December 2021. She was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and mutilation of a body. Eaton County Prosecutor Douglas Lloyd said that throughout the trial, Deneen played the blame game and pinned the entire murder on her mother. Christopher's testimony was the turning point in the trial, and Deneen was found guilty on all charges. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, there was one more person who had to answer for her crimes, and investigators set out to learn a bit more about Beverly. Investigators discovered that Beverly had been married twice before starting a relationship with Roberto in 1988. After she relocated to Jamaica, she married her longtime lover, Rinnie McCallum. Then she returned to Texas in 2007, after which Rinnie was declared a missing person to this day. In 2015, she was last known to be living with her mother, Mary, in Texas, when she met Zishan Muotsam, a Pakistani teacher, through an online dating site. Soon after, Beverly married Zishan and moved to Pakistan in June 2018, just as the investigation started to heat up. When warrants of arrest were issued for Beverly and her accomplices, she had already settled into life in Pakistan. It seemed like Beverly had managed to flee the country and escape the justice system. But all that was about to change. In February 2020, Italian police made contact with investigators from Eaton County. They reported that Beverly had been locked up in an Italian jail. According to the police, Beverly had checked into a hotel in Rome, and when her name was run through the system, warrants for her arrest were found on the Interpol database, prompting them to formally arrest her. It would take another 2 years before Beverly was extradited to the United States, as the Italian justice system didn't agree with a first-degree murder charge. It was only after officials in Michigan agreed to charge Beverly with second-degree murder that the extradition was approved. In March 2024, Beverly McCallum finally went on trial. Defense attorney Timothy Havis argued that Beverly did not play any role in the death of Roberto, but was lured into taking a ride with the actual murderers. But the state prosecutor, Douglas Lloyd, ripped into the defense's argument. Lloyd presented several witnesses that included Sicily and suspect-turned-witness Christopher. In her defense, Beverly alleged that she'd been unaware of what transpired the night Roberto was killed and only followed her daughter Denine's instruction. She denied any wrongdoing and continued to maintain her innocence. On April 1, 2024, after deliberating for just 1 hour and 50 minutes, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Beverly McCallum was charged with second-degree murder in the death of Robert Caraballo.
So on count one, we the jury find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder. On count two, we the jury find the defendant guilty of dead bodies, disinterment.
On May 23, 2024, 63-year-old Beverly McCallum was sentenced to serve 40 to 60 years in prison for second-degree murder in the death of her husband, Roberto Caraballo. She was also given a 10 to 15-year sentence for the disinterment and mutilation of a body to be served concurrently. In court, Sicily Caraballo read out her victim impact statement and finally put the pain her mother caused her to rest. Beverly McCallum's actions have destroyed the lives of so many, not only those of her daughters, but also the lives of Roberto's family, who will always miss his strong presence in their lives. Her actions were motivated by a selfish desire for her own happiness. So today we ask you, do you think that Beverly received her rightful punishment? Or was Beverly truly a scapegoat in her daughter Denine's murderous plan? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you found today's video interesting, please consider subscribing to M7 Crime Storytime, hit the like button, and share our videos with other crime aficionados. Also, if you have any crimes that you'd like us to cover, leave us a message in the comment section below. Until next time,